Welcome back everyone. My name is Sagar and in this video we will be learning everything about fragments. So what are fragments, how to create them, how to use them and what is the life cycle of your fragment. So without making any further ado, let's get started. So here is our project that we were already creating from our previous video, and here we already learned about all these folders and also about activities. So if you don't know, then go watch out our that video first. So what is a fragment? A fragment represents a reusable portion of your app's UI, and a fragment cannot live on their own. They must be hosted by an activity or some another fragment. The fragment's view hierarchy become part of or attaches to the host's view hierarchy. That means a fragment is a part of our UI, and for our UI we have to define it inside of our layout files. And for this file here we have this activity main. So let me just control and press. So this was the original UI of our main activity first file, right? So here we have this image view comment, and after that there are these two text view and one view and one button. So let me just remove all of this. So first of all these things that we just deleted, this edit text, this text, or even this image view, so all these were our part of UI. That means if we are defining an image view, so it is a part of our UI that we can only use once. But if we are defining a fragment here, that means the fragment is a reusable portion of our UI. So let me just quickly remove this. So if you want to use a fragment here, then you have to add the fragment tag like this, and here we can just use this. So this is our fragment, and now we can define our layout width and height. So it can be match parent and match parent, and after that you can close it. So here you can see it is not showing here some anything, and that is because we don't have to use this thing. We have to use here fragment container view. So this will be the part of our Android X libraries. So here you can see it is saying replace with Android X dot fragment dot app dot fragment container view. So if we are doing this fragment container view, so you can just use this thing, and make sure if you are not, and if you are getting here an error, and if you are getting here an error and that is saying it is not recognizing this thing, then that means you have to add the dependency for this fragment. So I already told you this thing in our previous video, that whenever you have to add a dependency, then you have to add it inside this Gradle scripts, inside this second file, that is your build.gradle module app. So inside this, first of all we have plugin, and at the bottom we have these dependencies. So here we have to add a dependency like this. So I will write here fragment and implementation. You can add here Android X dot fragment, and you can just use both of these, this one and this one. So I am gonna add both of them. So first of all this, and let me just copy it. So I will write here this KTX extension. So KTX means this is a Kotlin extension implementation that will just provide you some advantage of using Kotlin language with our fragments. Okay, so this one is for Java and the second one is for Kotlin. So after this you can just see there is this sync now button, and just click on it. So I will close this now. So still you can see we are not getting anything here, and that is because we have to define a different class for our fragments, and that means we also have to define a different view for our fragment. So first of all, let me just create a different class. So inside this folder, I will create a class here, new Kotlin class, and I will just name it example fragment and enter. So this is a fragment class. That means we have to tell our compiler that this is going to be a fragment. So for that, we have to extend our fragment class. So fragment. So you have to use this one, Android X dot fragment dot app, and after that, this will be a constructor call. So inside this, as you can see, there are two options. That is, first of all, no parameter, and the second one is, so second one was for our layout file. So there is an option that we can define our layout file for our fragment inside of this constructor, so that we can just create a fragment with that particular UI file. Okay. So for that, what we can do is we can just create here our resource file, our layout file. But this is a long way as we were already doing with our activity. So instead, what we can do is I will just delete this, and the same as we were doing with our activity. So we can just go here inside this fragment. We can create here a blank fragment, but this will also generate some unnecessary code for you. So you just have to remove all of them. So what I will do is I will write here example and finish. So you can see there is a lot of unnecessary code. So I am gonna remove all of them. So this companion object and this on create view is needed. So okay, we can also remove this. We are gonna define our UI inside of here. So let me remove all of this. And here you can see our activity layout file, our fragment layout file is also present here. You can see fragment.example, and it is saying here hello blank fragment. So inside of our this file we have to define here r dot layout dot fragment example. So this will be our constructor call for our fragment, and we are passing here an argument. So this fragment library also provides more specialized fragment based classes, like there is also some dialog fragment. So we will be also learning about what is a dialog and how we can use this dialog fragment. Let me just write here val. So you can just see this thing, we can import it, and here we have to use this androidx.fragment.app. So this library also provides us a lot of features like this dialog fragment, and after that we also have preference fragment compat that we can use to display a hierarchy of preference object as a list. So we are not gonna see all these special types, but we are gonna focus on this fragment. So what is a fragment? Okay. So after this, as you can see, we just created a fragment, and now we have to attach this fragment to our activity, because as I already said, fragment cannot survive on their own. So a fragment represents a modular portion of the UI, and a fragment has its own life cycle that receive its own input events, and you can also add or remove fragment while the containing activity is running. So as I already told you that we have to add a fragment inside of either one activity or inside another fragment. So let me just remove all of this unnecessary code here. So inside our activity layout file, we have to define here a fragment. So we are already defining here fragment container view that will represent our container for our fragment. So inside this container, if we have to tell that this is going to be our fragment, so what we have to do, we have to define here a name attribute. So Android colon name. So there will be a name attribute for this fragment container view. So this will be a container, and inside this container we are defining this layout. So we have to define here complete package name. So what we can do is fragment, and you can see there is our complete package name. So I will press enter, and now you can see this represent our example fragment. Okay, and I think this error is redundant. So this Android colon name attribute specifies the class name of the fragment to instantiate when the activities layout is inflated when we are on this line. So here we are inflating the activities layout. So when this layout is inflated, the specified fragment is instantiated. So inside our fragment, so then on inflate is called on the newly instantiated fragment, and a fragment transaction is created to add the fragment to the fragment manager. So there is also a fragment manager that we will completely learn about. So for a brief, fragment manager is just the manager of all our fragments. You can just click on this and drag it to the bottom and select this and drag. So here you can see we already defined our four constraints, and now let me just define some margins so that we can differentiate between our this layout and this fragment. So what we can do is instead we can define here a margin of 30 dp. So here now you can see there is a margin of 30 dp inside of our fragment. Let me just increase it to 50 dp. So what we can do is we can just define here a color so that we can at least differentiate. So if we have to define a color for our whole fragment, then we can just define it here inside of this root layout. So this is our frame layout that I already told you that this is used to represent a frame in our UI, and we can add multiple elements, but it is recommended that we just add one element. so that if we have different sizes of our screen, then we can just create a clean UI. So if we are adding a multiple elements here, then you have to define here gravity for all the elements and using the gravity attribute. So this layout gravity attribute, okay, and that will represent where this layout or this view will go inside of our screen. So we can just define here center. So center, and so this layout is already centered because as you can see the layout width and height is match parent, and that means this text view is for our whole screen. And if we want only the text view to wrap the content, then we can just do wrap content for our height and wrap content for our height and width. So now you can see this is at the center. So what we can do now, we have to define a background color for our whole fragment so that we can differentiate that this is our UI part of our activity and this is our UI part of our fragment. So we have to define our background color at this frame layout. So what we can do is we can just use this background attribute. So here we can define some colors here. So I will just use this teal 200. So you can just define color of your choice inside of this values and colors.xml, and you can also choose it from here. So now you can see this color is for our whole frame, and after that, now let me just define a background color for our activity. So what we can do is we have to define a background color for our whole activity. So we can just define it here inside of this constraint layout. So I will just use the background color, and now I will define purple 700. So now you can see there is some dark purple color, and inside this we have a teal color. First of all, you can see we are defining a constraint layout that is of whole screen, and this is our activities layout. And inside this, we are just using a part of our fragment that is here inside this, and it will just show us a teal color. So let me just try and check in inside of our emulator. So I will close this thing here. So now you can see our launch succeeded, and now it is showing error. So let me just check what is the error. So inside this logcat, you can just see what will be the error. So let me expand, and here you can see some red lines, and this will be your error. So it is showing here runtime exception, unable to start activity, and inflate exception binary XML file number 18. So it is inside 18 line. So here this is our error, I think. Let me just read it more. In line 18, inside of this activity main, and it is saying here error inflating this frame container view. Okay, and let me just see, it is inside this line 14 of here. Okay, okay, so I don't know why this is giving us an error. So what we can do is we can just do an alternative. So instead of defining here the name, so what we can do is we can just define here class, and this will work the same. So this fragment container view should also have ID. So container, and that's it. Let me just try again. And if this method also doesn't work, then we also have another method that we can define our fragment inside this fragment container view in our activity file. So we can just define our fragment here, and we can just use here support fragment manager, as you can see here this thing. So we can just use this thing to set a fragment inside of our fragment container view. So let me just see if the error is still here or not. Okay, now you can see the error is resolved, and here we are. So here you can see this is our hello blank fragment, and inside back we have our activities layout. So first of all, you can see this is our activity, that is your purple 700, and after that we have our another fragment that is here reusable portion of our UI. So it is our another fragment, it is our another view. So here we have our blank fragment that have this layout, that have this color teal. Okay, So I hope now you understand how we can create our fragment, and let me also show you the third method, how we can instantiate our fragment inside of this activity. So first let me just remove this class attribute from here, and after that inside of our main activity file, so what we can do is this support fragment manager. So as I told you, there is a support fragment manager that will manage our transaction between our fragments. So it will just handle all the things that makes our fragment reusable part. So after that we can just find here some method. So inside this there should be a begin transaction, and after that here we have to now add. So inside this now you can see there are multiple options. So what we have to choose is this. So inside this what we have to add, first of all, id of our container. So this is our container id, and after that we have to define our, as you can see, fragment. So what we can do is, so I can just define here this example fragment, and this should be an object. Okay, and after this now I have to commit it. So now let me just check if this is the same thing or not. And now you can see this is the exact same thing that we were previously doing. So here we are defining our fragment inside of our Kotlin file. So now you can see this is our background file, that is the layout of our activity, and inside this we have one fragment container view, and you can see we are defining nothing inside of this fragment container view, but instead what we are doing is we are defining our transaction. So that means inside this fragment container view, we are doing a transaction of this fragment. So inside this container, we are doing this transaction. Okay, and you can also animate your transaction, or you can just change your transaction when we are doing some condition. So what you can do is you can just see here a button. So I will just define here a button. So button wrap content, and text should be change. And now we will define our another fragment. So that's it, and this should also have id. I will write here button, and after this now we have to also define our constraints. Let me just close this thing. This should be at the bottom and at the center, and also I will define here some margin bottom. So margin means the distance from the view to some another thing. So I will define here 10 dp, and then this should be now more. So I will define here 80 dp. Okay, so first of all we can just click on this change button, and we can just change our transaction. So what we can do is we can just access this button here. So well, button, this is a type of button, and what we can do is we can just access this button id using the find view by id. Find view by id, and what is the id? This is our button. And after that now what we have to do, this is now giving us a redundant error, but just ignore this. So what we have to do, we have to set here an on click listener. That means when we are clicking on this button, we have to start a new transaction. So let me just make this thing first, because whenever we are starting our activity, whenever we are creating our new activity, so I hope you already know the life cycle of our activity. So whenever we are in this on create, so whenever activity is created, so we are just adding one fragment here, and that is our example fragment 1. And after that when we are clicking on the button, so we have to define our on click listener. So button object dot on click listener, you can see there is a set on click listener method, and we can just set here. So I already told you about this thing in our very first video. So inside of this what we can do is we can just start here another transaction. So I will just call this fragment manager, and I will begin a transaction. So what is the transaction? So I have to add something to my container. So just access the container here. So this is the container id, and what we have to add, we have to add another fragment. So I will just write here fragment example fragment 2, and I will pass here the object. So this should be a constructor call, and after that I can just commit it. So commit means, that means we are starting the transaction. So this begin transaction method will just tell that now we have to start a transaction, and when we are committing it, so that means we are executing it. Okay, so now we have to define this example fragment 2. So for that I will just right click here, new fragment, and this should be our empty fragment. That means this blank fragment. So this should be our example fragment 2 and finish it. So again, there is a lot of boilerplate code. So let me just remove this thing. And now this time we can just define our view inside of this on create view. So I will also tell you about this fragment lifecycle very quickly. So as I already told you that a fragment has its own lifecycle, and this will also execute some methods that we already saw in this main activity. So this fragment has its own methods, that on create view, on create, on detach. So we will just see all of them. So first of all, let me just create here another. So what we will do is I will just define here some another string. So this is our example fragment 2. So after this we can just define it as wrap content, and this should be also wrap content, and gravity should be center, layout gravity should be center. And now we have to also define here color for our frame layout. So what is the background color? So background equal to, now this time we can just define it black. Okay, so our text is now hidden, so we can just define it as purple 200. Okay, so this is our something different color, and the text is example fragment 2. And let me just close it here, and inside our fragment 1 we have this teal color, and this is saying hello fragment, hello blank fragment. Okay, so now let me just also close this, and also this thing. So here you can see the difference. So inside of our example fragment, let me just control alt and L. So this will just format our code. So we don't even need this body. So inside this, what we are doing, inside this we have a class, and we are just extending this fragment class, and we are passing our layout. So that means we will just create a fragment with this corresponding layout. So we are just creating a fragment, and after that we are using this fragment inside of this main activity. But when we are creating our second fragment, so we are just doing that inside of our on create view. So there is this method on create view, and inside this we have this thing inflator that we will just use to inflate our layout. And after that we also have this container that will just represent the view group. And after that we have the exact same thing, saved instance state, that we also have here, this saved instance state. And I already told you about this thing in our activity lifecycle video. So this is our on create view method, and inside this what we have to return, we have to return a view. So what view do we have to inflate? That is our this layout view. So I will just use this inflator dot inflate. So inflating means that we are now just creating our view. So that will be our this layout file, and after that this is a container, and this is just attached to parent. You can just learn this thing. This is more of a boilerplate code, so you don't have to just remember this thing. So you just have to see this thing, that we are defining our layout here, and when we are clicking on the button, so we are changing our layout, we are changing our fragment, we are starting a transaction. So let me just click here now. So now you can see our launch is succeeded, and first of all we are seeing here this first fragment, and that is because we are setting it here. And after that what we have to do, we have to click on this button, and we have to transact to our new fragment. So I will just click on this change, and now you can see our fragment is changed. And this is a very amazing thing, that we are doing a transaction from one layout, from one whole layout to another different thing. So there is whole new layout that we are going to see in our activity. So fragment is a very amazing thing, and that is why it is called as reusable thing. So inside this screen, you can just define your whole layout, and after clicking on the button, after clicking on some button, you can just add a functionality to change to some another layout. So, so you can just create here multiple screen without actually creating our activities. So this is a very powerful thing, but as you can see, we are doing a lot of boilerplate code. So we are defining here a fragment, we are adding it to our container view, we are adding this transaction, on which button do we have to click, and how we will make transaction between our fragments. So this is a lot of boilerplate code, and we don't have to do this thing. So for that we will just use our navigation component from our jetpack, and we will just learn about that in our next video. So now I will just tell you, when we are closing this transaction and we are creating a new transaction, so what will happen for this fragment? So actually what is the life cycle of this fragment? So there are a lot of methods like we have in our activity on create, on pause. So we will just learn everything about this fragment. So now let me just tell you about the fragment callback methods and about fragment lifecycle. So there is this cool flowchart and it is a very straightforward thing. So first of all, we have these states for our fragment lifecycle. So first of all, this created, then started, then resumed, and so on. So we will just learn about all of them. So first of all, our fragment callback method is onCreate, as we also have with our activity. So for activity, we have this onCreate method, and we also have the exact same thing for our fragment. So this is our example fragment first, and I also did this thing. I am inflating my layout inside of this on create view so that you can differentiate when we are creating our view and when we are creating our fragment. So there are two different things. This fragment is different from our views inside of our fragment. So that's why you can see this is our fragment life cycle and this is our view life cycle. And there are also comparatively more methods inside of our fragment. So first of all, we also have this on create method. So on create, and as you can see this thing, so this is our on create method of fragment. So first of all, before deep diving into this on create, let me just tell you, to manage lifecycle, fragment implements lifecycle owner. So inside this fragment class, so this was a constructor call. So let me just show you that this will implement this thing, lifecycle owner. So this exposes a lifecycle object that you can just access through get lifecycle method. So inside this we can just use this get lifecycle, and this get lifecycle is the method that we are going to use. And for our Kotlin, we can just use this lifecycle, and this will just return us the lifecycle of this fragment. And there are some enums that we can just use to represent the state of our lifecycle. So dot. So here you can see this is our current state, and here we can also add our observers. And this was the life cycle of our fragment. But a fragment's view has a separate life cycle that is managed independently from that of the fragment's life cycle. So there are two different things. First of all, the life cycle of our fragment, as you can see, and the life cycle of our view inside of our fragment, and they are independent of each other. So if you want to access the life cycle of our view, then you can just use our life cycle owner, and you can just use this thing. So get view life cycle owner, and this is the method that we are going to use. And for our Kotlin, we can just directly use this view lifecycle owner, and this is the same thing. Having access to the views lifecycle is useful for situations when a lifecycle aware component should only perform work while a fragment's view exists, such as we can observe our live data that we will also learn in our next video. So using this, we can just access the lifecycle of our views, and here you can see lifecycle, and there are some methods here, there are some extension functions here. So after that, let me just tell you about fragment and what is this fragment manager. So when a fragment is instantiated, it begins in the initialized state. So as you can see here, for a fragment to transition through the rest of its life cycle, it must be added to a fragment manager. The fragment manager is responsible for determining what state its fragment should be in and then moving them into that state. So when a fragment have to move from this state to this state, then this will be the responsibility of our fragment manager. All right. So beyond the fragments lifecycle, fragment manager is also responsible for attaching fragments to their host activity. So as you can also see here, this was the example. So this is the task of our fragment manager, that we are binding the fragment to this host activity and also detaching them when the fragment is no longer in use. So when we are doing this thing, so we are detaching our previous fragment, and this is also the task of our fragment manager. Okay. So fragment manager is a very important thing for our fragments. So for this, when we have to attach our fragment to our host activity or when we have to detach it, so we have these two methods that is here. Uh, it is not written here, but we have this method that is here on attach and on detach. So let me just show you inside of this. So control O on attach. So as you can see here, we can just pass here the context or an activity. So there are these methods that we can use. So I think it is deprecated. So we should use the another one on attach. Okay, so we can just use this thing that when we have what we have to do when we are attaching our fragment, and we can just use the corresponding on detach method. So this on attach callback is invoked when the fragment has been added to a fragment manager and it is attached to its host activity. Okay, so if you want to get a fragment from the fragment manager, so what you can do is you can just do here this support fragment manager dot find fragment by id. So you can just pass here the id of the fragment that you want to access. And this on attach method is always called before any lifecycle state changes, okay? And the on detach will be called after any lifecycle state changes. So what is this activity created state? So when your fragment reaches the created state, it has been added to a fragment manager and the on detach method is already called. So before this thing, we have the attach method, okay? So first of all, we have to attach and then we have to create our fragment, okay? So this is the method where we have to restore all the states that we might lose in our fragment. So same as in activity, we have this on create and this is the same method in our fragments. So after then what is this? Fragment created and view initialized state. So the fragment view lifecycle is created only when the fragment provides a valid view instance. So in most the cases, you can just use the fragment constructor that takes the layout ID. So that we were doing previously here, which will just automatically inflate the view at the appropriate time. And you can also use this thing on create view to programmatically inflate or create your fragments view here inside this thing. So here we are creating our view. So now this view is created. So that means this is also initialized. View life cycle is initialized. And after that, we have this view created. So after the fragments view has been created, the previous view state or the view's life cycle is then moved into the created state. So after this, if we have to, then we can just restore the state of our view inside this method, okay? So you can just get all these methods by clicking on this control O, or you can just write here and there will be a suggestion. So on view state restored, as you can see here. So after this on view created, then we can call this method. So after this created state, then we have our started state. So it is strongly recommended to tie our lifecycle aware components to the started state of a fragment, as this state guarantee that the fragment view is available to us, okay? So if we want to access some views inside of our fragment, then we have to do it inside of this state, started state. So we will be learning about these lifecycle aware components in our upcoming videos. After this, we have this resumed state. So when a fragment is visible, all animator and transition effects has been finished and the fragment is after that ready for user interaction. So this will be called as our resumed state. So this is a very basic thing that you already know from our activity lifecycle video. So after this resumed state, there will be started now downward state transition. So as you can see, this is now started, created and destroyed. So now I will just tell you about this. So when a fragment moves downward to a lower lifecycle state, the relevant lifecycle.event is emitted to observers. So first of all, what is this view started state again? So as the user begins to leave the fragment and while the fragment is still visible, the life cycles for the fragment and for its view are moved back to the started state and emit the on pause event. And after this started state, we have this created state. So once the fragment is no longer visible, the life cycle for the fragment and for its view also. So you can see there are these alternative methods, okay? So for both of them, we will be moved back into the created state and we will just emit on stop method, on stop event. And after this, we have this on destroy view, and this is where they will differentiate. So first of all, we will destroy the view and still there is the same state for our fragment life cycle. So first of all, we have to destroy the view. So after all the exit transitions, then that means the fragment view has been detached from the window, and this is where we will call this thing. And at last, we have the fragment destroyed. So if the fragment is removed or if the fragment manager is destroyed. So first of all, there is a fragment manager in which we have to add our fragment, and inside our fragment we have our views, okay? So there is some structure like this that you have to understand clearly. And after that, you can just extend all these functions here and you can just present here these log statements that we were doing previously here. So you can just use this timber library to log, and I will just leave this thing to you that you have to override all the methods that are defined here and you have to check what is the life cycle call when we are destroying our fragment and we are initializing our new fragment. So you have to add this timber log messages inside of this both fragment file. And now after this, do let me know what is the lifecycle callback methods that first of all we will call here inside of this logcat. So first of all, we will just destroy our this first fragment, and after destroying this fragment, then we will initialize the transaction to our second fragment, okay? So this thing is up to you. You have to try this thing by yourself. So in this video, we learned everything about fragments. So what is a fragment, how you can create them, and how to use them. So in the next video, we will be navigating between our fragments. So we already know how we can navigate between our activities, but in our next video, we will be navigating between our fragments. So thank you for watching.